curious your opinion on this, on the different scales of potential marine spatial planning and how they're sequenced. I have an opinion on this, but I've been surprised that other people have a different opinion. The question specifically is, sort of I think in the United States, we're mostly, when we talk about marine spatial planning, we're talking about the theory of it more than the practice of it. Although the examples of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and a little bit in Oregon are there. But I mean, it's sort of, so we idealize it, and we're helping to, as communities, we're helping to invent it, and so in an idealized way, I picture eventually you have nested scales of planning, and then you have to think about how edges match between different kinds of plans. I mean, and so would you see ideally that a regional scale plan would occur first, and then local scale plans would be nested within that, or the other way around? Or do you think it doesn't matter?
That's a good question, and I would say it's not that it doesn't matter, it's that we don't know. And in keeping with the new humble attitude towards resource management, I think the answer is that we should try a bit of both. And in some places they're going to be moving, some places are already ahead of others in doing state planning, so we can then move to the regional planning that fits in with the state. Other places they've done absolutely nothing, and maybe the regional planning will move ahead, and we'll see how that works. I don't think there's any way to say convincingly or to demonstrate that one is clearly better than the other, and I think we're going to try a bit of both, and as we go ahead we'll learn, and it goes back to that adaptive management cycle. We'll monitor and see how it's working and talk to each other. One of the things that is a frustration to me that I'm trying to remedy but have not effectively done yet, there's a lot going on in this country, around the world, and we are not very good at learning from each other's mistakes. When I first started this again 2 years ago, and I spoke to some people in Massachusetts who were trying to do this planning, and people in Oregon, and they had never spoken to each other. They didn't know each other. Now that's getting slightly better. States are talking to each other, but there's still a lot of groping in the dark going on. And I'm hoping that we can. Actually, groping in the dark sounds kind of fun. Maybe that's not the right analogy. I'm hoping that we can come up with a better, probably end up being some kind of web-based system where we can trade experience and actually learn from each other.
Follow up with your comment about Louis' question that the land use planning concept, private property regulation, versus viewing it kind of the opposite side, the ocean, and that public trust. Because I think you can also make your, and my question is going to be probably how much analysis of the land use planning experiences that we've had are you finding that's actually informing the marine spatial planning side? Because well, there's been a lot of successes, there's also been sprawl, and we've recognized that all of a sudden there can be other types of incentives that get created that we didn't anticipate. You're using this pretty significant difference, public trust versus private property, and I guess I'm going down the path of, well, is that going to make a difference in whether or not we'll have all these other unintended consequences of sprawl in the ocean, or what are they going to look like?
This is exactly where my mind was going a year ago when I decided that it would be fun to spend 2 years writing a PhD dissertation. I think people are, it is fun, it is fun. I can tell you it beats working. I think a lot of people have very glibly said, oh yeah, it's, planning, we've done planning before, we know how to do planning, and we'll just do more planning. And if you dig a little bit and look at sort of the history and how it's happened and how people have done planning and the theory behind it, and it's not so simple. I think ocean planning is more analogous to public lands planning, to planning national parks and Bureau of Land Management lands. The Bureau of Land Management owns huge tracts of land that they're supposed to manage for some combination of grazing and mining and recreation and all those things. That's probably closer to the marine example than land use planning. The reason I talk about land use planning to a lot of audiences is just it's much more familiar, it's much clearer. Oh yeah, right, you don't want the park to be next to the prison, or whatever it is, the playground. But really, when you dig in legally and technically, it's actually more analogous to public lands management. In Europe, interestingly enough, they really pushed the land use analogy. And there, it's very much an extension. They use the same laws, they use the same agencies to just extend their land use planning into water. And the reason it's so different there, I think, is just a sociological and cultural thing. They're much more accepting of centralized government. So the government has always done the land use planning in a fairly top-down kind of way. But there's stakeholder input and everything. But there isn't the same kind of, don't you dare tell me what to do with my land. So they've done that kind of planning, and they're extending it into the ocean. Here, there's never been easy acceptance of government planning, and in some regions of the country, there is no such thing as land use planning, like Texas. And you see what Houston looks like. So there's a lot of things we need to look at more carefully to avoid making the mistakes we've made on land. There are people who are studying, for example, some people would say that the Bureau of Land Management has been an utter failure. They've done a terrible job managing the lands under their control because their budget actually depends on the revenues they get from allowing users to use the land. So they get huge amount of money from the people who do grazing and mineral rights and all the rest of it. And that's inherently a conflict of interest and that has made them overuse the lands. There are analysts who will say that. And of course, Minerals Management Service is very much in the news right now, wondering whether they've been too cozy with the oil industry. Again, oil industry generates a lot of money. So in land use world, people have suggested that in fact you need separate agencies to deal with each of the separate uses. That you need an agency whose job is to push, let's say, or manage oil, manage grazing, manage protected areas, and then they have to work together. In the ocean right now, in a sense, we have all these different agencies, and we're saying they need to be better integrated. So then do we recreate those same problems if you integrate them better, that there's conflict of interest between the people who want to promote use and get money and royalties from that and the people who want to protect? How are we going to deal with that? I don't have answers. That's what I'm hoping to come up with a better answer and framework for in the next 2 years.
I think that part of the reason why it works in the marine environment using the terrestrial model is not necessarily the differentiation between the private property and the public trust areas. It's the management of the use. And it's the use that happens in your spatial areas, what you're trying to manage, not the who owns the physical piece of real estate that's there. And being a planner by trade and a purist by trade with that, it's not that planning is broke, it's the political will and courage that's broke. That anytime you grant a variance or something that goes against existing public policy, that's when you unfold public policy and it goes in a different direction. If you can convince your elected officials to stay the course with their existing public policy, you might have a model that might work.
Right. And does it seem like there's much chance of convincing politicians to do that?
That's what the purist thought.
So, I mean, so it goes back to the question, can we create a structure, can we create a process that's less likely to be hijacked by those kinds of political interests and, private interests? Remains to be seen whether we can or not. But I think we certainly should be cognizant of the problems we've had as we move forward in the ocean. And my impression has been, and it's funny because 2 years ago I was a huge marine spatial planning booster. I was just out there, rah, this, we got to do this, we got to do it now, it's going to be fantastic. And the more I dig into it, the more I see, it's not so easy. Let's not do it wrong. Let's not look back in 20 years and say, oh gosh, we made a mess of that. That didn't come out the way we thought it was going to do. Which will happen anyway because that's life and that's how the world works. But at least let's try to walk in with our eyes open and realize that we have tried similar things. Let's learn from them. Let's learn from our mistakes. Let's go slowly. Let's be adaptive. Let's really look hard and see if some of the problems that have arisen on land are coming up and how we can address them. So, I mean, I still think that we'll need to do something like this in the ocean, but there are plenty of ways we could go wrong.
You talked about the different ocean users not wanting to add any other regulatory burdens on them, any other authorities. We can do it with the existing authorities, and that hopefully the plan will sort of make agencies talk better to each other and think about different authorities as they're planning. Yet those kinds of authorities already exist, and we saw them fail in the MMS NOAA example as one example. So do you think that that's a feasible way for marine spatial planning to work forward in terms of implementation, or do you think there is going to have to be a higher authority that's going to say, hey, you guys aren't talking to each other? In your mind?
There's going to have to be a requirement to actually come up with a plan, and for the agencies to then make subsequent decisions within the parameters of that plan. There's disagreement about whether that requires a new law, or whether in fact the executive branch has the ability. Right, all these agencies work for the president, right? They're all supposed to be working together. So some people have said all the president needs to do is say, hey, you guys work for me, you're my cabinet members, I'm telling you I want this plan, and then I'm telling you that within your existing authorities and everything else, I want you to be consistent with this plan. So, and some people say it's got to come from Congress. Congress has got to pass a law saying to do it. So there's some disagreement about that. There was something else I was going to say. Tell me go back and reword the beginning of your question, because it made me think of something else I wanted to say. About the agencies.
The users don't want any more.
Right, right. One of the things that people have proposed is to make the spatial plan stand in for some of the existing elements of regulation. So, for example, again, I don't know if everybody is familiar with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and how that works. You have to do an environmental impact statement if what you're doing is going to have an impact, an environmental impact. So right now there's something called a preliminary environmental impact statement, and some people have said that the planning could stand in for that preliminary impact statement. The way that you're gathering data, the way that you're saying what effects might happen by different activities, and then coming up with, well, this would be a place where it would work. Again, there's some detail, and I'm sure lawyers could spend a week-long conference arguing about whether planning could stand in for a PEIS, preliminary environmental impact statement. But that's one of the kinds of things that people have proposed, that the planning would replace some of the hoops that the industry has to go through in getting permits.
Branching off Susan's question, you're talking about adding more responsibility to organizations that already exist, which sounds all well and good, but this is in the middle of a recession where state budgets are strapped, federal budgets are strapped. How is that? They've already let employees go, and now they're getting more work to be done.
Right. Well, I mean, as always with these answers, part of it is just, again, goes back to political will, and it seems that this administration, this is a priority. They have put some money into backing up marine spatial planning, NOAA, MMS, and one other agency, maybe USGS. Someone else, the three federal agencies got some money specifically in the last budget to promote marine spatial planning, so there's a little bit of money in there. Ultimately, I don't know if you guys have seen, let alone read, the U.S. Ocean Commission report. It's that big fat doorstop thing, 211 recommendations. And I helped write that thing. And their vision is that ultimately this could be self-sustaining in the royalties that people would pay. Right now, people use that public space, right, which belongs to you and me, pretty much free of charge. Oil and gas, they pay royalties. But other people are out there not really paying us for the use of that space. So they did some rough back-of-the-envelope calculations, the Ocean Commission, and said that if we adopted the principle that all users of ocean space need to pay some kind of, whether you call it royalty, fee, whatever, back to the public, that would pay for the management.